La réponse à ce genre de conflit n'est pas nécessairement de passer par les armes. Je pense que c'est avant tout un dialogue qui doit se faire autant en Occident que par les citoyens syriens eux-mêmes sur quel est le réel problème. Oui, ce sont des groupes extrémistes, oui, ils ne sont pas représentatifs de la communauté islamique en général. Comme dans toute religion, je dirais, il y a toujours une pensée extrémiste qui malheureusement amène ensuite une image négative sur toute une communauté. Après, non. Pour moi, les guerres, effectivement, sur le long terme, ne sont pas les solutions.
Long-term military action is definitely not a solution in combating ISIS because there are casualties involved. Civilians die. It plays into the hands of ISIS because ISIS wants to recruit Europeans and tell them, look at what they are doing to your brothers back at home. This is even more reason for you to come and take part in the jihad.
Hay otras posibles soluciones. Por ejemplo, hay muchos países que están recibiendo refugiados, lo cual me parece una muy buena acción. Muchos de los pobladores de estos mismos países los rechazan también. Entonces creo que lo que debe haber más que nada es una concientización de las personas desde el tema y que venga desde el Estado, o sea, que se implante en los colegios, en las universidades, en los institutos nacionales. Entonces, de esa manera no solo vas a contribuir a eliminar la guerra, sino a una mayor diversidad cultural y religiosa sobre todo, porque la ISIS finalmente tiene un origen religioso. Entonces, puedo cerrar diciendo que finalmente es la empatía, la resiliencia la que te puede ayudar.
D'instinct, on a envie de répondre par l'offensive, mais mes valeurs de la chrétienté me font penser qu'il faut s'aimer les uns les autres. Donc c'est assez dur en fait de répondre assez justement sans se faire marcher sur les pieds ou se faire tuer plus concrètement. Et enfin, oui, je suis assez partagée, je sais pas exactement.
The difficulty with the ISIS is that it's actually combining a number of different realms, social, political, historical, geostrategic. So there is no one straight panacea in terms of addressing that. Intervention is a problem. Military intervention of the sort that we have seen it has not simply worked. And I think there's a consensus on this when you look at the past 25 years. Iraq was more problematic because it was illegal and was not sanctioned by the UN Security Council, but the others meant to kind of fix a situation. The security has deteriorated, so you're dealing now with the consequences of the intervention on top of the problems that led to the intervention. So you have a double bind there. But even if you have a successful military operation, which is not yet seen, I stress, even if you had that, that would only be part of the problem. I mean, how do you deal with your integration? How do you deal with reestablishing the basic of a state building process? How do you deal with matters of transitional justice? How do you bring communities together that have been fighting each other? How do you work on the logic of restarting some sort of social contract in societies that are just coming out of conflict? Does military force address that? I doubt that. We think now all the time, where is the intervention? There's a normalization of that, a banalization, which I find highly problematic as such. The issue should always be about an attempt within these societies to actually develop, once and for all, I feel like saying, leadership in their midst that addresses these questions. Creating a regional environment that is much more, I think, supporting and generous, I feel like saying, vis-a-vis each other in a common security framework. As we've seen elsewhere in other regions, that this has worked. In Asia, in Latin America, in the EU, other places, the African Union is working on that. There's something that could be done at that level, which is still a gap in the region. And finally, of course, cleansing the geostrategics of this uber kind of great game type of logic that is replayed as such. And you have now a place like Syria where you have everybody playing with each other and attacking each other. And there's just way too many actors in a scene that initially was supposed to be simply a rebellion against authoritarianism. I think that in any radicalization process, we see some commonalities. There's a sort of so-called stairway case to radicalization, whereby any person, any individual around the world goes through a process where there are key ruptures, moments where the connection to addressing a disenchantment peacefully becomes radical. embracing violence, speaking in extremist terms, making that leap. So that element is important because it can be tackled. It's because it exists as a universal drift, then we can think in terms of de-radicalization, developing policies at the social level, at the cultural level, at the educational level, to even at the religious level, to try to bring that to an end and bring back those actors into some sort of normal process. Education, you can't go wrong with that. I mean, education, which has been neglected by many of these authoritarian states, there's only 1 or 2 countries, paradoxically Iraq was one of them, which had invested a lot in education in the 1970s. Very few of these regimes had invested in building and empowering a new generation up to the point that it would have at least the ability to tame and these tensions in its midst. Diplomacy is always useful. Diplomacy is actually quite an important tool. It has been paradoxically somehow weakened in recent years. We tend to look at it very quickly and we move to the military solution. No, I think diplomacy is an extremely important, neglected tool. It's the art of the possible, as they call it. It has worked in the past on very large-scale conflicts. Nuclear war in the 1960s. I mean, there are moments where engaging with even your worst of enemies in a way that is actually intelligent and trying to find a common ground with a view to avoid the consequences of that and meet halfway and deploy a sense of leadership, as I said, is something that is extremely noble and important, and we sort of have lost that.
The biggest stumbling block is the fate of Mr. Assad in any future administration of Syria, and the Russians and the Americans just don't agree. And this is a major problem for the solution of the whole problem of Syria, because we cannot look at the issue of ISIS in isolation. It's part of the Syria mess, and unfortunately that mess seems to be getting worse. The situation would be drastically improved if there could be an agreement in the Security Council between the Russians and the Americans on the future of Syria. That would then bring into play a political process with elections, and that the people of Syria can decide on their future. But it's unlikely that the opposition groups will participate in that as long as Assad is in power. So we have a kind of devilish puzzle to resolve. IPB has called for example, cutting off of arms sales and transfers to ISIS specifically, but also to all players in the Syrian civil war. We do have now an arms trade treaty, which most Western countries have signed, yet there is little sign of them really respecting it. Western countries, US, France, Germany, I think, are all busy providing resources to Saudi Arabia, which is the main aggressor, if you like, in that conflict. So one thing the West could do would be to stop selling weapons, and secondly to stop bombing, because bombing only creates more jihadis. Western powers need to concentrate their efforts on the diplomatic solutions, as we've said, but there's also something that Western countries can do back home, and that's to improve the treatment and the position of Muslim minorities in their own countries. We're talking about jobs, we're talking about housing, we're talking about discrimination, and we're talking about some kind of societal dialogue. But unfortunately, this comes at a time of increased sense of racism and fortress Europe, let's say, against this tide of refugees. So these two problems are interconnected, the violence in the Middle East and the homegrown racism. But simply to fall back on the old military solutions isn't going to work. We're spending hundreds of billions of dollars just here in Europe. So invest in peace. Invest in dialogue and negotiations, invest in social justice. That's our message. It won't come quickly, but to go the military route is only going to prolong the suffering of everyone.
C'est vrai qu'il est difficile d'envisager des solutions non violentes, faciles à mettre en œuvre, mais je pense quand même qu'il faut essayer, parce qu'on a je pense, pas mal de solutions comme la voie diplomatique, l'enseignement ou tout simplement la cessation de production et de distribution d'armes aux groupes terroristes. Et déjà, pourquoi pas envisager de qualifier juridiquement ce que c'est exactement Daesh et donc trouver des solutions juridiques. Mais je pense que la première chose à faire, ce serait d'arrêter de bombarder à tout bout de champ.